Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items this week, we have for you people taking antiparasitic medication meant for livestock in an attempt to treat the CCP virus. Analysis of just how many people in the wider population may actually be asymptomatic carriers of the CCP virus. Development of miniaturized brains that are also growing eyeballs. Antibodies that could be used to act as a male contraceptive pill, or at least close enough to, and the destruction of a satellite which, until recently, had an unknown cause. These and other news items can be found in the timestamps listed below in the description. Let's start with the case of an individual in Mississippi who decided to take ivermectin, an antiparasitic medication meant for horses, cattle, and similar, in trying to treat the CCP virus. This was at one point a theoretical lead that may have had some value. There was a possibility that through chance there was overlap between the medication's efficacy for worms and for the CCP virus. This is one way in which medication can be repurposed. That possibility has been investigated, and after accounting for the one particularly notable or notorious act of academic misconduct, there is effectively no evidence to support its use for the CCP virus. That's where this particular act of gross stupidity comes in. What's weird is that someone like this is going to an unproven, unrecommended, and certainly, relatively, proven to not work medication in lieu of proven efficacious vaccines. As a result, the Mississippi Health Department hasn't exactly been forthcoming with details, other than to make it known that the drug was used in a case of someone taking it to try and treat the CCP virus, and it leading to hospitalisation. This is again not all that surprising. Ivermectin has a range of side effects, and many of these can be adverse to your health, especially considering this is a medication intended for livestock. What we'll be curious to see is if this was yet another instance of attempted homicide, much like what happened with the, again, somewhat notorious case of hydroxychloroquine that came out about a year ago now. In more relevant news to everyday life, there's been an investigation, or more accurately a meta-analysis, of many different studies, more than 350, that was trying to figure out what an accurate representation of asymptomatic carriers of the CCP virus is really like. What they found is that it sits at a figure near to 35%. While this is nowhere near the up to 80% that was sometimes estimated, it's also far higher than the lowest estimates of about 4%. This means that approximately a third of all CCP virus infections don't present with any symptoms. This doesn't mean that 35% doesn't transmit the virus though, and that's an important distinction. Although there may not be any symptoms to speak of, this being things like loss of smell, a cough, fever, those sorts of details, these people are still carrying the CCP virus. That is, at least a third of individuals who are out there could be carrying the virus and not know it. You then have the percentage of the population that has the virus, knows they have it, and are carrying it. This together means there could be a significant percentage of the population that's either exposing others unknowingly or knowingly, and why many of the current methods available to restrict the transmission of the CCP virus are important. Think of things like social distancing, mask mandates, and in some instances, and more frequently now, stronger if not legally enforced mandates for vaccinations in certain instances and jurisdictions. Going from CCP virus-related news to instead news on clinical developments of contraceptive. This would have both certain advantages and disadvantages. Currently, the only option available is the female hormonal-based contraceptive pill. This effectively confuses the body into thinking it's already pregnant, thereby preventing another pregnancy from developing. Since the original contraceptive-based treatment is only tricking the body, there's relatively limited risk. Although, as with any medication, there are always going to be certain risks associated with it. This new treatment is based on using antibodies, and this would mitigate some of the problems associated with hormonal therapies. The antibodies are a specially developed version that is 99% effective at stopping sperm from moving on to then be able to fertilise an ovum, or at least according to the sheep models used. This obviously hasn't moved anywhere near a human trial yet, but it would be a certain advantage over some of the current hormone therapies and comparable to many of the contraceptives available on the market at present. Unlike many of the current contraceptives, this does carry many advantages without as many of the disadvantages. Going from contraceptive clinical trials, or at least trials of contraceptives, to a vaccine for the HIV, human immunodeficiency virus is a very difficult thing to treat. In fact, at the moment, it's largely treatments based on suppressing the virus and preventing it from proliferating and thereby creating a more complete and complex infection that causes more symptoms. A vaccine would be a huge achievement in dealing with that. This is where Moderna, one of the current developers of a CCP virus vaccine, has a role to play. They're about to start a clinical trial for a messenger RNA HIV vaccine. mRNA vaccines are what they've currently built their CCP virus vaccines on as well, so this is not an area that's necessarily new to them. However, the product is new, or at least this lead is, and it's why it's a phase 1 clinical trial involving 56 healthy adults. These people do not have HIV, and what they're trying to figure out is whether or not they can find a safe dose of this mRNA-based vaccine. Because this is a phase 1 trial, none of this is blinded and no one who's involved with it is going to be ignorant of what's happening. This is done for a couple of reasons. The first is simply that of the 4 groups, some will receive a mixture of 2 different vaccines. Some will receive individual vaccines, and what they want to find out is whether or not there are symptoms, and more importantly, to a certain extent, if there is an immunological response. Is the immune system activated and trained to respond to HIV? And that would be the important step. Have they found a way to target HIV, which is incredibly sneaky and often finds ways to avoid the immune system? This is why it is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to eradicate entirely. Going from vaccine development related news to development of miniature brain models. What is funky about these miniature brain models, made from stem cells, is that along with developing a brain-like structure, they've started to develop a rudimentary eye. The basis for this outcome is the development of a tiny brain or brain-like structure, made from pluripotent stem cells. These, once they started growing and reaching a 3-dimensional shape, somewhat resemble a brain, hence their name, mini-brains. On top of that, they started to further differentiate and create small structures that are light sensitive. And those are what we are describing as eyes in this case. Because these are stem cells that were created by taking brain tissue and reverse engineering it into a stem cell, many of the ethical issues involved get mitigated. In fact, this would be very much like taking a skin sample and reverse engineering it into brain tissue. The reason this is done is that these structures are often used to explore things like novel drugs. If you were to try and do this with a human or a brain, there's many issues associated with it. That's why this research, which is focusing on eye development, had to use such an abstract approach, which, while not a true brain or eye for that matter, is able to look at how an embryo goes from being two distinct cells with only half the number of chromosomes right through to something more complex. Admittedly, nowhere near the point of a developing embryo, but certainly something on its way there. This is important if you're going to try and look at developmental problems that occur during gestation. How does blindness occur in individuals who are born blind? Is it an eye-related issue, or is it something in the development of the eye, the optic nerve, and the rest of the brain? All these details are things that you can't explore using an actual model, or at least certainly not a human model. You have to find a way to emulate it, and you can only do so up to a certain point. That's where this comes in. Understanding the timing, events, and nature of the developments, and particularly how that eye-like structure grows, will help to understand how and if things occur and when they occur that adversely affect the development of humans overall in utero. Looking at animals other than humans though, we are having an impact outside of our species, and notably for mammals. A number of mammal species are getting bigger over the years, and it appears that this is a product of two things. One is human activity shrinking the native habitat for these creatures. The second one is these creatures coming into closer proximity to human dwellings and environments like cities. These two events lead to them increasing in size and weight. Bigger, stronger, and in sometimes with a raccoon, meaner creatures. In the last year, some major cities have noticed that there's been big issues with rats in particular. They have become more aggressive, and in some cases practically trying to attack people because they did not have access to food that had previously been available from commercial locations like restaurants. And without those restaurants in operation, these creatures didn't have a source of food. As a result, they became aggressive. You'll note if you ever spend much time outside in the wilderness, mice and rats out there are much smaller. In the city, they're much bigger. And these larger, meaner versions in the cities are what are occurring and appear to be driven by humans. This is supported by further research going back nearly 100 years. By examining museum specimens collected over that time frame, plus modern or at least relatively current measurements taken in literature, researchers were able to plot the relationship between size of many mammals closely tied into humans and the time frame involved, and to note that as these animals had greater access to food through burgeoning cities, the larger they got. This was in defiance of various other factors that should have led to exactly the opposite effect. The final news item for this week is astronomical news, or at least an explanation of old astronomical news. Back in March, a Chinese satellite broke apart, and nobody was entirely sure as to what had happened. It turns out that this is in fact one of the problems that's been described for quite some time now. In this instance, a case of Russian rocket that was space debris hit the satellite, destroying it. This is the concern that was held with what happened with the recent launched Chinese rocket and the boosters or engines returning to Earth in an uncontrolled manner. In other instances, it was when the Chinese destroyed one of their own satellites recently with a surface-to-space rocket. These two events were a worry because they produced a lot of space debris, and this is something that is an ever-growing worry. The amount of junk floating around the planet is getting more and more every year as more satellites go up. Old satellites are obsolete or they are shut down. In other instances, vehicles and other delivery platforms to get things into space are abandoned there once their cargo has been released. All of these things are causing more and more material to sit in and around the atmosphere and in low orbit space. As a result, things like this will happen with increasing frequency. The bigger the structures are, the more damage they will do when they come in contact, but even small material can cause a lot of harm. Think about what a small hole in the ISS recently caused with regards to atmospheric pressure. In this instance, the possible interaction of the Russian rocket and Chinese satellite produced 37 more bits of debris. That means one small accident can have a cascading effect that will keep growing, just like dominoes falling on each other. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.